This is Carolina Haints. Carolina Haints presents Folk, a show about our stories. I'm your host, Dan Sellers. The city of High Point was established in 1851, and since then the town hall has been changed several times. At some point in the 1800s, it was established at 103 North Main Street. In 1908, it was on Wren Street, then known as Jordan Street. And in 1923, a beautiful new city hall was constructed at 110 Commerce Street that housed multiple departments of city government, including the library, the police, and the jail. In 1973, City Hall moved to its current location at 211 South Hamilton Street. And, come a few years from now, it will once again move to take over an 11-acre campus of the First Baptist Church in the 400 block of North Main Street. But that's if the witch that haunts that location allows it. This story begins back in 1881, when a peculiar married couple built their home along Main Street, known then as Salem Street. Jane Grant Mann was a Scottish immigrant, and her husband, Charles Mann, was a German engineer who came to the Piedmont to work in the booming gold mining industry. He was beloved in the community, as many High Pointers were tickled at his funny accent and took to calling him the Professor. They both had an affinity for plant life, and together they established one of the nicest flower gardens in the city. Now, as I said, they were both peculiar individuals, which is another way of saying they weren't exactly like all the other folks from the area. They built their beautiful home and established residency when they were both in their early 60s. They didn't have any children. It's said that Jane was a particularly neat person who was perhaps overly concerned about dust and dirt coming in from the street. All visitors were asked to enter from a side door, as the front entrance and foyer was kept in a pristine condition, including a large oil-painted portrait of Jane herself. The house itself was one of a kind, a two-story structure, and was the first in High Point to feature a running water and sewage system. Okay, let's start over. This story really begins in the 17th century in Scotland. Jane Grant Mann immigrated to High Point from a small town in Scotland named Inverness. Jane's hometown was notorious for its tragic history of alleged witchcraft, which of course led to witch trials, torture, and executions. But it wasn't just Inverness. For much of the 17th century, Scotland was plagued by a moral panic, what's now known as the Great Witch Hunt, the most famous example being the trial and execution of Isabel Duff in Inverness in 1662. Throughout this period, it's estimated that between 200 and 300 accused witches were put to death. So let's fast forward a few centuries. Did Jane Mann escape persecution in Scotland to find solace in her beloved High Point? By the late 19th century, Jane was in her 70s and was well known in the community for how she obsessively cared for her flower garden. It was not uncommon to find the elderly Scottish lady tilling up soil or pruning weeds or walking around the garden at all hours of the day and night. They grew all kinds of flowers and plants, especially several species not native to the region. It was an absolute point of pride for Jane, and when she passed away at the age of 76, neighbors reported still seeing her caring for and admiring her garden. By all accounts, she was a benevolent apparition and seemed to ignore everything but her beloved flowers. She was seen keeping to herself, gliding back and forth through the best garden in all of High Point. The locals took to calling her a name derivative of her Scottish roots, the witch of Inverness. Now, that was a label she perhaps didn't quite deserve. Yet. However, by 1915, the professor, too, passed away, and the property at the corner of Main and Church was bequeathed to Jane's dear friend, Samira Burton, and her physician husband. They soon after moved into the house, and by all accounts, that's when things started to change. Not much has been recorded about what the Burtons endured at their time in the Mann house, but we know they only lasted there about a week. It seems the Witch of Inverness was perhaps starting to live up to the name. A local newspaper covered the event with the header, "Ghost Acts Like Witch." Did the Burtons fail to keep the house in the condition to which Jane was accustomed? Did they perhaps not keep up the garden as meticulously? I don't know about you, but my imagination runs wild with the images of... I don't know about you, but my imagination runs wild with images of the large portrait of Jane Mann on dark, stormy nights. Did her eyes just move? Who's to say what really happened in the Burton stint in the house? But one thing we know for sure is that a short time after, Dr. Burton hung himself. I have no way of knowing whether this was in any way connected to the Witch of Inverness and her alleged haunting. However, it's only added to the lore of her story. The Burtons sold the property, and several years later, the house was moved about a block west, where it stood for a few more decades. However, sightings of the witch on the grounds of her beloved garden persisted. In 1944, the city dedicated the land to something that would have been near and dear to Jane's heart. They built Tate Park, named after a former mayor, and made it a community garden, and allowed for local garden clubs to tend the flowers. Perhaps this was the best way to honor the Manns, because after this, sightings of the Witch of Inverness have died down considerably. That's not to say that the witch didn't still hold influence over the property. Over the years, there have been quite a few plans for that parcel, including a Sears and Roebuck department store that fell through. Before that, the American Legion had tried to raise funds to build a library and city auditorium on that spot. These scuttled plans have been blamed by superstitious high pointers on the witch. Eventually, the First Baptist Church incorporated the property and used that section of land as a parking lot. Now, the city plans to build a brand new city hall complex on the property, taking over nearly the entire block from the church. Today, Jane Grant Mann can be found in nearby Oakwood Memorial Cemetery. A tall pier marker looms over her grave and displays that she was born in Inverness, Scotland. This episode was brought to you by Recavid Productions and Carolina Haints Incorporated, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting folklore storytelling throughout the Carolinas. You can find everything we're up to, including the Carolina Haints book, podcast episodes, and speaking engagements at our website, carolinahaints.com. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Tune in to keep the tradition of oral storytelling alive.